The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is unit number 6. I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. So could I ask if you could just go over to the question box and just type in the word clear. That lets me know that I'm coming across loud and clear. That would be great. Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks, John. Thanks, Mark. Excellent. All right, looks like everything's going well. Now, obviously, you'll get the slides, you'll get the recording at the end of this. Thanks, Andrew. So all of that will be done, which is fine. And I guess this is the end, or the last unit at least, of the series. So we're going to look at an interesting topic today around building appropriate culture or good culture in our teams, which is an interesting topic and a very elusive topic. So I've got a lot to share with you today, so I think we should just get stuck into it. But of course, at any time you've got questions or you've got comments or observations, just go to that question box where you type that in, and I'll be happy to share that, or I'll be happy to answer that for you. All right, so this is the Lunch and Learn package, or the series that we've gone through at the executive level, and we've covered a fair bit of territory, as you can see, and we're right towards the end now with Unit 6, which is driving positive culture change. So I haven't left necessarily the best to last, but obviously if you can build a good culture up, then you're in a very strong position to build performance and a whole range of other very positive indicators, as we know. So we're going to talk about that subject today. Okay, now just before we launch into that, of course, I did give you some homework, and last time we met, we did talk about conflict styles, and I asked you to complete that conflict resolution diagnostic, and what it was showing you, of course, is which of those 5 conflict styles that you could relate to most. And the whole objective of that exercise, of course, was to suggest to you as a senior leader that you should be using all 5 approaches. That is, competing, collaborating, accommodating, compromising, or avoiding. So you should use all of those whenever the opportunity arises. And of course, the other message out of that is if plan A doesn't work, then don't despair. There's always a plan B or a C or a D, or in this case, an E. So the whole idea is to be flexible. And that was the whole purpose of that exercise. Because as a senior leader, you're always in a position where you're going to be faced with the need to negotiate and to compromise. You're going to be in a situation where there's going to be conflict and vested interests and a whole range of issues that have got to be dealt with. So that's what that was all about, and I hope you've had a chance to be a little bit clearer about that and think a little bit more about that in terms of your own leadership approach and style. So let's launch into today's topic and look at some of the things we're going to cover. There's a fair bit I'm going to get through, but I'm going to talk about what culture is, because I think, just because we say culture, what do we actually mean by that? What does it look like? And I'm going to suggest to you, and some of you in the private sector, some of you are in the not-for-profit and the public sector, I'm going to suggest to you that the concept of being an ambidextrous organisation should be appealing to you, so that we've actually got 2 sets of values in the one organisation. I'll talk about that in a moment. We'll talk about the emotional stages of change, the stages that people actually go through in their change processes. I'll share with you the 8 core values of high-performing teams, or should I say high-performing organisations. And then I think we're pretty much done, and perhaps I might even share with you where you might like to start. All right, so let's launch into a definition of culture. Now, this definition here is my definition. I think if you went and Googled organizational culture, you'd probably come up with thousands, tens of thousands of definitions, but I think this definition is fine. And you'll notice that I've highlighted the key words in the definition because I just wanted to talk a little bit about those. But But ultimately what we're talking about is a basic pattern of shared assumptions, values, and beliefs considered to be the correct way of thinking about or acting on problems and opportunities facing an organisation. That's essentially it. So it's, I suppose in plain English, it's the way we do things around here. And it's always interesting to me as a consultant because I work across 21 industries. And it's really interesting. I can go into different industries and have very, very different cultures. And, you know, it's fascinating. I go to another organization, have a completely different set of culture, and you sort of say, well, where did all that come from? So it's very real. So the question is not, do we have a culture? The question is, do we have a culture that is supportive of a high-performing organization? That is the critical question, because you get a bunch of people together on a desert island or anywhere, and there will be a culture to emerge. So the key question is it a productive or an unproductive culture is always the question. So, and you'll notice that one of the key words there is correct. So correct meaning, of course, correct in the context of that organisation. It may not be correct elsewhere. So, you know, if you look at what happened with Enron in the United States and the obvious ethical issues around Enron, what was considered to be correct practice in that organisation was clearly not correct practice overall in organisations. So people are led to believe that it is acceptable, or at least acceptable or correct within the context of that organisation. Okay. So another thing about culture that's important is, of course, there are explicit and implicit aspects of culture. And I kind of like to talk about that as the tip of the iceberg. So you've got the iceberg and the water. Most of the iceberg is below the waterline, but there is a part of the iceberg, of course, that's above the waterline. And what that implies from an organisational culture perspective is that these are the things that are very obvious that you can see, such as the uniforms that people wear, the physical structures, the formalities, the rituals, the ceremonies, the stories, the language, the formality or in the degree of formality or informality in the organisation. So when you walk into an organisation, those things are the first things to hit you right between the eyes. But of course, there are other aspects that are not quite so obvious, and you'd have to spend time in that organisation to understand those beliefs and values and assumptions that are perhaps not quite so obvious on the surface. Let me give you an example of that might make sense. A person who I knew had just joined an organisation, which will remain nameless, and that organisation, and of course this person wanted to create the right impression, as you do, and what he did is he decided to stay back late in the afternoon. And he would often work quite late into the evening. So he invested long hours in this organisation. He had lots to do, but nevertheless he was attempting to set a good example and do the right thing, or what he thought was the right thing. And he found that one day somebody came up to him in the lunchroom privately and actually said to him that he was showing everybody up by hanging back late on those evenings. In other words, the implication was that we don't stay late here, that we leave on time, and we expect that everyone else will too, you see. So that put enormous pressure on my friend to make a decision about whether or not to toe the line or whether or not to continue that behaviour regardless of what that person might have said. So it's a very interesting, all of these things come in different ways, shapes and form. So every group of people has a culture, and some of it's obvious and some of it's not so obvious. Now, I guess the question is why do we have a culture? So if you look at this diagram, it gives us several reasons why we have a culture, and it makes perfect sense when you think about it. So if we start at 12 o'clock there, it serves as a sense-making and control mechanism. So if we know how things are supposed to be done around here, then obviously we can look at things through the prism of how it's done around here, and it provides a control mechanism. human beings fundamentally like to know where they stand in relation to, whether they're doing it right or wrong, as we've talked about. So obviously that helps a lot. Going around clockwise, it also defines the boundaries of what appropriate and inappropriate behaviour is. And I might put that in inverted commas, because what's appropriate may not necessarily objectively be appropriate or even ethical, but within the context of that organisation, it's perfectly okay to act that way. Another reason is that it's a sense of identity. So it gives people who work there this sense of identity of who they are. And we all want a sense of identity. So, it might be the uniform, or it might be the cause, or it might be the friendships, or whatever it is. It gives people this sense of identity about where they belong. It gives people a sense of commitment beyond self-interest. So in other words, by having a culture, it basically gives people an idea that it's not just all about them, that there's a wider and broader concept here around the culture of the organisation and how we deal with other people within that organisation. It also provides stability, so that when we hit the rocky roads, which is inevitable, people will kind of know that they will be able to have something to fall back on, which is the culture of the organisation. So there's a lot of reasons why we have it, and so it's a fundamental human need. And the question now we've got to ask ourselves is, do we have an appropriate workplace culture, one that's going to contribute to our best interests and the interests of the organisation? So it is possible to change a culture, and I'm going to give you a couple of ways of doing that. First way I'm going to do that is a fun exercise that I think, and when I say fun, I don't mean flippant, by the way. This is an exercise that's enormously powerful, and I strongly recommend that you do this with your senior team. And it's a great way to get a glimpse at what other people believe to be the culture in your workplace. So, and I'll give you two examples that I used when I did this in organisations, one positive and one not so positive. But basically, you've got three questions that you ask people, and I suggest that when you ask people these questions, that you get them to write down the answers, for the reason that I want them to actually think carefully about the answers. So the first question I'd ask people is, if you had to describe your workplace as a colour, what colour would it be and why? All right, so the colour is the metaphor, so people come up with the colour. And then, of course, they have to think about a reason why it is that colour, red, for example. The second question is, if you had to describe our workplace as an animal, what animal would it be and why? All right, again, the metaphor is the animal, but by going through these three questions, you're likely to cover a significant territory around people being able to describe to you what they believe the culture is in the organisation. And the final question is, if you had to describe your workplace as a motor vehicle, what vehicle would it be and why? Now, I'll give you two examples that work for me. Well, at least I'll explain to you how it came out. One organisation I did this with was IBM. Now, IBM, this was the IBM in its heyday. This is when IBM was number one. This is when IBM was basically ruling the world in terms of technology. And I asked the senior team what colour they would describe IBM. And there were a couple of variations on this, but the main colour was gold. And I said, why? And they said, because we're number one, which they were at the time. I said, what animal would you describe IBM as? And they said, we would describe it as a cheetah. Why? Fast moving, agile, all of that kind of thing. And number three, if you had to describe IBM as a motor vehicle, what would it be and why? And they selected a car like a Ferrari with all the bells and whistles on it, because we're number one. So it was very interesting that that was the sort of feedback I got. So you get a very quick snapshot about what people think about the culture. Now, of course, if you just ask people and said, what do you think the culture is here? People will look at you in a strange way, because they probably haven't thought about it, and it might be difficult for them to think about it. But at least with these metaphors of colour, animal and vehicle, it makes the thing a lot easier, and of course it adds an injection of humour to it all too, and you get some really interesting answers. Now I also did this with Queensland Rail, or QR, many years ago, and it was going through a pretty tough spot, although some would argue it's still going through a tough spot, but never mind. And I asked the team that, and the colour they selected was black. And the responses I got is nothing terribly exciting, or black hole, things go missing. It wasn't particularly inspiring. The animal was an elephant, slow to change, never forget was the other response I got. Or elephants never forget, they carry grudges. And the animal was a Holden, because at that stage at least, I think it was something in the order of 80% of people that worked there were male, and normally their father had worked, in a lot of cases their father had worked there, their grandfather had worked there, and the animal and the vehicle they selected was a Holden, very much a family type of scenario. So I found that very interesting. So totally different cultures, but using the same approach. So I would commend that to you. I'd give that a shot. You'd be surprised how incredibly effective it is. And what you might like to do is to ask them those questions, and then to stop, obviously get their feedback, and you'll hear the common themes running through. And then, of course, and have a laugh at the same time, but then you ask them if you could actually describe the culture you would like it to be, and this is very applicable with the senior team. If you would like it to be, what would it be and why? Animal, vehicle and colour. And of course, there's going to be a gap between where they are and where they'd like to be. And then your question is, how do we fill that gap? So that's something that I think you might find very interesting and worthwhile. Now, this exercise here is a little bit more, scientific, or the one I'm showing you now. And I won't run through all 10 dimensions, but these are the 10 key dimensions of organisational culture. So don't panic, I'm not going to run through them all. You're going to get these slides, but what I'm saying is that you can actually give this out to people and ask them to rate their organisation on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is high, 1 is low. And these parameters will make a lot of sense to you, because these are the dimensions that Robbins and his colleagues argue are the key dimensions that define what an organisation's culture is. So let me pick a couple out, give you an example of what I'm talking about. So let's take number 6, control. The degree of rules and regulations and the amount of direct supervision to oversee and control employee behaviour. Now, if that's very high, you'd rate that a 5. So in a paramilitary organisation such as police, you would expect that to be high. Not only is it going to be high, you would expect it to be high, because in a crisis or an emergency, people basically can't be sitting around collaborating. You've just got to get on and sort it out. So that's obvious. But then if it was a startup IT company, you might find it's a very low score, because there are hardly any rules, any regulations, and basically in those early days it's fly by the seat of your pants. Pick one more just to give you an idea. Seeing as we covered conflict last time, look at number 9, conflict tolerance. The degree to which employees are encouraged to air conflict and criticism openly. So organisations where there are robust conversations, quite heated at times, but then after that's been done, everyone gets back to work. I think about places like orchestras, for example. People can get very irate and upset, but as soon as the concert starts, or the day of the concert, everyone's professional and just gets on with it. You might want to, so you'd probably rate that a 4 or 5. So you can actually go through and get people to do this, and it'll give you some really good indicators around what people think around culture. So that works for you. Okay, so you've got 2 options there, the fun way and the simple way with the colour, animal and the vehicle, or you can do it a bit more scientifically using this approach. Now, I did mention at the outset about this concept of ambidextrous organisations. Now, this was an article written, it was quite a while ago now, by O'Reilly and Tushman. And the article, which was quite intriguingly titled, The Ambidextrous Organisation. And what they were actually arguing is that organisations can have a dual set of values. And in fact, they actually argued that organisations should have a dual set of values. In other words, every organisation needs to have rules and regulations and procedures and policies and processes. And if they don't have those things, of course, there's no consistency to how they do their business. Whether it's an entrepreneurial organisation or a government department, organisations to some degree need to have a regulatory environment. But on the other hand, if that's all the organisation is, then it's hamstrung because it's not agile and it's not able to, people aren't sort of game enough to show initiative and all that kind of thing. So there needs to be a innovative and growth set of a set of values as well. So what they argue is just like ambidexterity, and normally we think about sport. If you're going to play tennis, for example, if you're ambidextrous, you can probably play with the right hand as equally as effectively as you can play with your left hand. In my case, I can't play with either, but anyway, that's another story. So ambidexterity, and the whole notion of that is that an organisation can also be, on the one hand, very regulatory, which is the left-hand column, and on the right-hand column, it can also be quite entrepreneurial. So you might want to think about how, where your organisation is, and obviously you can be one or the other, and it's quite possible that one could be skewed, that an organisation could be skewed towards one or the other. Normally, in my view, it's been skewed to the left, because it can be quite regulatory to the point where innovation and all that sort of thing is stifled. So as a leader, you can do that. Let me give you a very practical thing that you can do, which could just alert people to the need to have what O'Reilly calls an ambidextrous organisation. Get your team together and then find a whiteboard and draw 2 lines down the centre. And so you've got basically 3 columns. Now, on the left-hand column, you write down the word, well, you don't have to write down anything, but you can write down the word initiative, if you like. And you ask people to identify to you all of the circumstances, situations, and examples where it would be appropriate for them and others to show complete initiative. And these, of course, would be in fairly unique sort of situations. So you write those down. Now, you might find in a regulatory environment that's going to be quite difficult for people to come up with anything. So you just have to persevere with that. But you'll get a list, no doubt, if you can, hopefully. And then go over to the right-hand side and then put down the word regulatory and ask people to identify all the things that have to be done by the book, all the things that have to be done by a procedure, and all the rest of it. And of course, in a regulatory environment, you'll probably get a list a mile long. So you write a few of those things down. Now, I should say to you that neither of those are problematic. I think, when people have to follow systems, generally speaking, they do. And of course, when there is complete autonomy to show initiative, generally speaking, people do. It's this middle column that becomes interesting, because in this middle column, you ask people to write down, or you write down, all of the things that can either be done showing initiative or following the system. So in other words, you've got a choice. You can go one way or the other, and try and get a list of real life examples of that. Now, this is the area where the biggest problem is in becoming ambidextrous, because in that middle column, if it's a highly regulatory environment, it's highly likely that people, when given a choice between showing initiative and being regulatory, will default to being regulatory. Why? Because there's less risk involved, of course. And so if anything goes wrong, I can always say to my boss, well, you know what? I was just following the system. And so, it apportions blame nicely to the system rather than themselves. So by doing that exercise, simply, you're just alerting people to the fact that there is opportunities either way, and also there are some things that can be done both ways. So have a think about that. So ambidexterity is an interesting concept in organisations. Now, one of the things I wanted to just share with you, oh, by the way, I will share with you an example, just to put this into context. I was working in I'll just go back because that's, go back to that slide, there we go. I was working in an organisation about 2 weeks ago, and it was really interesting because this is a private sector organisation. It was in the building industry, I'll say that much. And in this industry, there was a or in this organisation, there was a purchasing officer. Now, the purchasing officer had very clear instructions that they were to purchase on the last day of every month. So the whole idea is that, you could calculate things, and at the end of the month, it was the day, or at least the working day, the closest working day to the end of the month, ordering was done. So, the purchasing officer would just go ahead and do their thing, of course. But what was interesting about all that is that, several months ago, she told me a story that they had just received a new customer in the building industry. So a new customer, a massive customer, in fact. And this customer, she knew on good advice that this customer was going to order a serious amount of product, but they had only just signed up to the company at the beginning of the month. So if she'd stuck to her regulatory thinking, that is, ordering at the end of the month, then this customer is going to be pretty upset because they're going to have to wait 3 or 4 weeks in order to get their order, at least, not to mention the time it got to come back. So she showed initiative and decided to order, or break the cycle and order during the month because of this customer. So you can see that's a good example of where you could actually be very, you just follow the system and say to the new customer, sorry, we've got a process in place. We order at the end of the month. But in this case, she decided to break those rules for the customer. And obviously, she did the right thing. Whether or not she was rewarded for that's another thing. But the point is, she was willing to take the gamble and order. And it is often a gamble, of course, isn't it, to be agile and think outside the box. Whoops, went too far there. Let me go back. Now, one of the things, oh, by the way, has anyone got any questions or observations at this point? Because I've covered quite a lot of territory, and I'm more than happy to have a listen to anything that people have got. I'm trying to give you a mix of kind of theory and also some very practical things that you can use back in the workplace. But speaking of theory, to me, this is one of the most powerful models that I have actually come across. It makes a hell of a lot of sense. That when people go through change, they ultimately go through 4 emotional stages. And I'll give 2 examples of this to make sense of it. But basically, this model comes from Scott and Jaffe, who identified 4 emotional stages of change. And you can see there's denial, resistance, exploration, and commitment. And what Scott and Jaffe was saying was that you'll notice over here that this is productivity. So you've got high productivity, low productivity, and over here is the time that something gets taken to be done. So you start off with strong, high productivity, and then it takes a very sharp dip down here, and then it lifts again to commitment. So this is one of the most powerful change models I've ever seen. One of the problems I've got with a lot of the change models that are out there is that they're all about things or processes. At the end of the day, we're not trying to change processes, we're trying to change people. And I think we lose sight of that. We're trying to actually put all sorts of slick processes in place. But if we could just understand the psychology of what people go through in change, then it would make sense that if we can actually contribute at different points, respond at different points to those emotions, then we're likely to facilitate a much smoother change process. Common sense, I would have thought. Anyway, So, and I'm going to use two examples. One of winning lotto, I wish, and one of I'm going to use an analogy, a police analogy from the work with police. So here's two analogies, two completely opposite analogies. But in the process of denial, people are really not thinking about the change at all. Okay, so they're just oblivious to the change. And I see this a lot where someone will, a manager will walk into a meeting or will call a meeting and will explain a change that's going to occur next week. And, they do that. And then at the end of their presentation, the manager says to people, has anyone got any questions? And nobody puts their hand up, nobody's got a question. So the manager interprets that as, this is good. Obviously, there's no objections to the change and everybody's on board and away we go. And then when that manager leaves the meeting, she or he notices two people at the water cooler. And these two people are whinging about the change. And the manager says to them, look, you had an opportunity in there before. Why didn't you bring this up? But in actual fact, the manager's making a mistake, because what's happened is that since that meeting, people have absorbed the information and have moved into a state of resistance. Okay? So a smart manager will do this. They'll have a meeting, they'll explain, what's happening next Monday. They might ask for questions, but they don't expect them because they understand that psychologically or emotionally they're in denial. But they do say to people that we're going to have another meeting, in 3 or 4 days' time. And in that meeting, you have an opportunity to bring some questions and discuss the change. Now that's smart. So what happens is that over the 2 or 3 days that elapse before the next meeting, there's going to be some significant conversation and thought around the change. And what will happen is that people will actually be quite angry about the change come the next meeting. It'll be a totally different meeting, but it's controlled in a room, and that's the critical thing here. So these 4 emotions cannot be bypassed. They're part of human nature. They're very real. Let me give you an example. Let's pick the lotto one first. Let's do a positive one first. All right, let's say you're sitting there at the moment, you're in the lunch and learn, you're focusing on me, and then all of a sudden your phone rings and you think, oh, well, I better answer that. And you answer it, and the person on the receiving end says to you, congratulations, you've just won $40 million through lotto. What's your reaction going to be? Well, obviously, you'd be thinking, who is this? This isn't real. So you'll actually be in a state of denial at the beginning of that because you're just not expecting it. It's completely out of the blue. Now, the same principle occurs, and one of the things that I would imagine one of the most difficult jobs that a police officer has to do in their career would be to actually knock on someone's door and explain to them that their son or daughter had been, injured or even killed in an accident that night on the road. I would imagine that would be pretty tough. Not just, of course, for the police officer, but, as part of their duty. And normally I would imagine that what would happen, not that I've ever done that, of course, but what I would imagine is that when they knock on the door and Mr. and Mrs. Smith open the door, they see 2 police officers at the door. The police officers ask to come in and explain the situation to them. Mr. and Mrs. Smith will initially be in a state of denial. In other words, they will not be able to absorb the information. They'll probably say initially, are you sure you've got the right house? This can't be real. When am I going to wake up? You'll get all that sort of kind of comment because they just don't want to accept the reality of the situation naturally. Now, so then you'll notice that on the map there, or on the model, it goes down to resistance. And this is where people start being hostile, productivity drops off, there's finger pointing, blame, criticism of the change, you know, it's open season. And of course, we all know in our organisations that that's a very real emotion when change occurs. First thing I want to say about that is you can't avoid that. You are always, always going to get some resistance in any organisational change, positive or negative, but you're going to get it. The question is, how do you manage it, not how do you bypass it? So let's go back to Mr. and Mrs. Smith again, and the police. By the time the police leave, Mr. and Mrs. Smith are probably going to be, you know, angry about the local government that, you know, there were too many potholes in the road, or the police were revenue raising over here, not, you know, there'll be all sorts of comments about criticism about, you know, everybody and anybody because of this, you know, wanting to apportion blame essentially. And of course, you know, you get the phone call from Lotto. Well, of course, you're not going to blame the person ringing you once you find out it's true, but you'll go through a state of what we call cognitive dissonance. You'll be going through a state of unbelievable. You just find it very hard to comprehend the whole thing, and you'll be in a state of confusion. Albeit it won't last long with $40 million, but it will be there, at least initially, and you'll be in a state of flux and won't be able to concentrate on anything around you at that period of time. Now, the third stage that people go through is exploration. That is where people accept the change, but their skill set isn't particularly high. That's why it's low on productivity. But they understand that, you know, with a bit of practice and so forth, they can start building up their skill set. Again, let's get back to the analogy of the police. Mr. and Mrs. Smith will look at each other at some stage and say, look, all we can do is, you know, is take one step at a time. We can't think about 2 weeks ahead. We've just got to do what we need to do today. And tomorrow will take care of itself. So, you know, if this person's been in a, you know, is in serious intensive care in a hospital, their son or their daughter, then their first thing is to get to the hospital. Nothing else is going to be important but just taking that first step. Now, with Lotto, of course, denial goes to cognitive dissonance, and then, of course, exploration is all the lists and dreams that you and I have ever had in our life. We suddenly realise can probably be expressed through this incredible amount of money. So we'll be able to do some incredible things. So we'll be making lists and our priorities will chop and change at different times. We'll be exploring what we can do. Now, you ultimately get to a final stage of change, and have you ever noticed that the greatest resistors that you've got to change are often the greatest advocates for the change later on? It's really interesting. So at that final stage, you get a situation where people will, you know, they'll look back on it and realise that, I get it, I understand why it had to happen. So the Lotto one, of course, is, you know, break out the champagne because you've won 40 million. But even with the police analogy I gave you, Mr. and Mrs. Smith might sit down 20 years later after that fateful night, and Mrs. Smith might look at Mr. Smith and say, look, you know what happened 20 years ago obviously was very, very sad, but I must admit the one thing it did do is it brought us closer together. So there'll be a silver lining to the cloud. And that's what happens in all of our kind of situations in life, that we often look back on it and can make sense of it and understand the value of it. And of course, when you got the Lotto example, as I said, it's break out the champagne. So energy levels are high, and you know, productivity's high and morale's high and all the rest of it. Now, if you think about your own work that you do, is it not true that you go through those 4 emotional stages, you personally, but also your team? So the question is, what can you do at each level? Well, as you can see on the left-hand side, I've given you some answers there. People need information at denial. They need to understand that the change is real. At resistance, people need you to shut up and listen to their concerns. You don't have to agree with them, but you just need to give them that airing to be able to, you know, talk about their issue, you know, what they're concerned about. That's why it'd be sensible for that manager to have a meeting to give information, leave it for 3 or 4 days, come back and find that it's a totally different meeting, and then he or she spends that next meeting very much listening to what people have to say. Exploration is really about you being out and about, coaching and mentoring and assisting wherever possible is critically important. And then at commitment, of course, you need to do a couple of things. First of all, you don't want to get too complacent because you'll be going down the roller coaster ride again. So when people say life is a roller coaster ride or a roller coaster, you can see that there's a little bit of, it's quite a profound thing to say. It is. It's one roller coaster ride after another. And at commitments, you want to do two things. Celebrate success, so you keep people's energy levels high, and also review progress. So you want to go back, do an after action review, what went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently. Because each of those interventions requires a different approach. So hopefully you find that one quite useful when you're dealing with change. In other words, we're changing people, not process. Okay, now this is a very busy slide and probably you'll zone out when you see it, but you can read it in your own time. And I just wanted to sort of talk about it, but has anyone got any questions or comments? Because now is a good time to ask, but we're, no, all good? Okay. So look, when your relationship with your team members is something that can be called a psychological contract. Now, what I mean by that is psychological means it's in your head, right? And contract means between two or more people. So we have these contracts we carry around in our head about our employment relationship or the contract we have with the organisation. So an individual has a certain type of beliefs in their head about what an organisation should be able to do for them. They also have a certain number of beliefs about what they're prepared to do for the organisation. And of course the organisation, through you as the manager or whoever it might be, they also have a certain set of beliefs about what the organisation can provide for the new employee, and also what their expectations of the new employee are. So this is called a psychological contract, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I've just got a statement here that I'll just get to. How does self-generated change differ from imposed change? Good question, Chris. They both go through the same cycle. So if you impose change on someone, or it was imposed upon you by the organisation, then whoever the imposer was will get those four emotional stages I mentioned before, and because of that, they should, based on what I said, plan for that. In other words, they should think about, all these stages, they're totally predictable, and what should I do? For self-generated change, that is where you make a change yourself, you go out and you do something differently, you will still go through those four emotional stages. You might not realize it. Say, for example, let's say you go and do another degree or a course of study or something. Well, that's a self-imposed change for you. The first thing you'll think of is, oh, well, I'll be able to fit this in and around my work, no problem. So you're in denial about the workload. This is just a sort of a thing I can do part-time. And then, of course, you'll realize that it's quite a serious challenge you've taken on, and you're going to be quite frantic about it and quite resentful when lecturers don't just point you in the right direction. Of course, you don't want to fail, so you explore how you will manage all of that, and you do that. And of course, once you've finished, you can often say, well, that was worthwhile. So you see you're going through it all. So every single thing, that's why I think it's one of the most brilliant things I've seen as far as change, because every single thing we go through, positively or negatively, self-imposed or imposed, self-generated or imposed, we still go through those. Hopefully that helps, Chris. All right, thank you for the question. That's great. Now, if we come back to this psychological, gone too far there. If we come back to this psychological contract that I mentioned, I won't go through it all laboriously with you, but I just simply make the point that over here you've got management beliefs, and these management beliefs are the right beliefs to have in terms of the contract. This is a shared value that you're hoping in the contract is shared by you and the people that work in your organisation. And I'll just move that across so I can see what I'm doing. Sorry. And over here, of course, you've got the management's expectations of employees and the employees' expectations of managers. So what I did is I came up with this new psychological contract because I felt that the old them and us contract was falling apart, and in fact it has. It started to fall apart in the 1980s when there was all of the downsizing, and a lot of people that had spent their whole life in the one organisation were thrown on the scrap heap, and people became very disillusioned with the traditional employment relationship. And what happened, and what is still evolving, is a new psychological contract. And I thought, well, what about if I can get some sort of a framework around what that actually looks like for processes such as recruiting the right people, creating the right organisational culture, explaining expectations to people, and so forth and so on. And also, could I get the right management team around me who believe in the new psychological contract and not the old, bark a few orders and just hope people will jump. So this is, I'll let you have a look at it at your own leisure. I won't bore you with it all now, but I just simply, a couple of key things is that the second column there are 8 values that I've identified that are critically important to create a culture that is productive. Okay, so there they are, and those values are the exact opposite, interestingly enough, of the traditional employment relationship values. For example, flexible deployment replaces specialist employment. Customer focus replaces quality assurance. Performance focus replaces job focus. Project-based work replaces hierarchically based work. Human spirit and work replaces disengagement. Commitment replaces loyalty. Learning and development replaces training. And open information replaces closed information. So this whole contract has been turned on its head, and all I've tried to do here is get a framework around that. Now, I just want to take that a step further and just say to you, okay, well, if you were wanting to change the culture of your workplace to better reflect the new psychological contract that I've just shared with you, how might you go about that? And here's how you'd go about that, or at least in my case, this is how you go about that. Let me just build this up for you. The very first thing in order to create a new culture in your workplace based on those 8 values I shared with you is that you need to define a workplace sample. Now, what I mean by a workplace sample is you'd think to yourself, who will we engage in this survey? And in this case, I would say the more the better, of course. And I know we're all surveyed out, and here's another survey, but I think, this can be done online and it's not too onerous, but it'll give you some baseline data to work with. Now, what are we surveying? So the next key question around this survey is, first of all, we administer the survey. Now, the survey is based on 80 statements around those 8 things that I just went through, those 8 values. So the survey is administered. The next key thing is that we analyse the results, so it creates a report, and the report shows us where the organisation sits around those 8 values. I can give you more detail about this if you're interested offline. I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea how you do this. Step 4 is that we then form a project team. Now, the project team is an exact replica of the organisation. So what we're looking for is to whittle down a group of people of around 12 to 15, if it's a large organisation. If it's a small one, it can be less, that are basically a representation of the organisation. What that would mean is if we had 12 people in a room, then there would be a minority of managers in the room, because that's exactly how the organisation operates. There would be some managers, but it wouldn't be top heavy. We'd have people from the various departments, and so it takes a little bit of time to form that project team. But when you get that right, the project team has a power of its own, because it is perceived to be clearly representative of the organisation in general. So what are they going to do? Well, we do a bit of team building because they're going to work together and they've got to work effectively. So we do a little bit of that. And the most important role of the team, or the project team, is to develop some strategies to improve the culture that I just showed you, the values, to improve the culture of that organisation. So they actually generate a second report, which is basically the report around what they're going to do about it. So the questions would be around, is this information reflective of your experience? Can you give an example? And what strategies would you use in order to move the organisation on? So then that might go to the senior team for approval, and then 12 months later, we review the organisation again and see how far we've progressed along the road to that new psychological contract I talked about before. So that's another sort of involved approach you can use when it comes to change management. So any questions or comments at this stage? No, well, we're pretty much done, folks. I've got some homework for you, so you can use any of those templates, of course, to plan your next change or your next culture project. Of course, I won't be around next time, because there isn't a next time. This is our last session, so I just wanted to thank you very much for the opportunity of working with you over the last couple of months. I've enjoyed it. I always do. It's a bit funny, isn't it, doing it through this sort of medium? I mean, if you're in a room, of course, I can see all the snarls and smiles and all the rest, but I know you're there because I can see the numbers on the screen. But nevertheless, I've enjoyed it, and I hope you've got something useful out of it. And more importantly, I hope you've actually gone out and tried some things and experimented and done some things with this, because if you haven't, then it probably creates, it's probably not a great thing to do. Just got a comment here from Andrew saying giving people time to reflect on change seems very necessary. Absolutely, Andrew, it's critically important. So you actually have to create that time, and that's where, moving from that denial to resistance, you need to create that time to absorb the change as such. So thank you for the comments. Anyway, folks, I just want to say thank you. If you've got people in your organisations that you'd like to put through Lunch and Learn, let me know, because I've got other ones around, team leader ones. They're not all senior executive. Well, this is just one strand. So if you've got other people that you think would benefit, same process, 6 sessions, you know how it works. Drop me an email, and if you've got more than, say, well, not more, I know for sure. If you've got more than 6 people, I would give you a 10% discount. But anyway, enough of the sales pitch. Thanks, Alyssa. That's very kind of you. Thank you very much, Tim. All sessions been very worthwhile and engaging and worthwhile. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Enjoyed the series as usual. And all right, well, that's great. Thank you. That makes me feel as if, it's been worthwhile. So thanks, everyone. All the best, and have a great weekend. And who knows, we may see you around the track sometime. And thank you, and all the best. So thank you and goodbye.